I have a lot of fears. I don't know about you. We've got to learn how to battle these intense emotions called fears, and we've been doing that for the last couple of weeks. This is the last installment of that series, and has it helped you at all? If you haven't been here for all four, you can download all the messages on our City Church Canada app, and we actually are getting a YouTube channel going together, so you can also find us on YouTube. So love for you to get connected and find out all those other messages. And the first 2 weeks, we looked at the life of Joshua from the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, and we saw that fear is a normal part of the faithful life. It's a part of everyone's life, whether you're a person of faith or an agnostic or an atheist, that all of us deal with fear. And if you are a person of faith, it's not weird, strange. It's not because you're a bad person that you're going through fear. That's a part of every great person's life, that God does great things oftentimes in our fears. And we saw in the first two installments that Joshua had to overcome the fear of overcoming a leader that was a giant of a leader, Moses, right? That he had to kind of walk in his footsteps. And so there's this fear of failure, this fear of not being enough that he had to battle. And the last week we saw the fear of the disciples in the boat, in the storm. And we saw how Jesus was able to say, "Peace, be still." And how Jesus, at a moment's notice, was able to stop the wind and the waves from coming into the boat. He has that kind of power. Today, however, we're going to look at a storm that Jesus was not able to stop. It was a storm that although he has so much power and so many incredible teachings, miracles, go down the list, Jesus was not able to stop this storm, this train from coming at him. And we're going to be in the story of Mark chapter 14 today, but before we do that, I want to tell you a little story about the McGregor boys, if I could, for just a minute. I'm not going to tell you the identity of them because I don't want them to get mad at me later on, but it's been testing season at the McGregor house the last couple of weeks. How many parents are in testing season right now? Young adults, right? You're midterms, you're just finishing midterms, and then you get this incredible to look forward to final exam season. That's always fun, right? But, my two boys approach testing season very differently. My one son, again, who shall remain nameless, he had 4 tests in 2 days. That's not really fair, right, to go have that much pressure on you, but such is life, right? And so he had to prepare for 4 different tests, 4 different subjects. And so just like probably you do, you start quizzing your kids, right? So let's test to see how you're doing here. And so he had a science test, and it happened to be a really intense science test. It was deciding the distance between all the planets and the gravity and the light years and on and on and on, detail after detail of the whole planetary system. And my son decides to wait till the night before to cram all that information into his incredible brain. Now, I knew within about 5 minutes of testing him that this was not going to go so well for him. I knew very quickly that he was not prepared for that test, and in fact, I was actually right because he got the test back, and he didn't do horribly, but he definitely didn't do as well as he could have done. My other son, on the other hand, had a math test in that same season of life, and again, I put some questions together, and it was very evident in the first 3 to 5 minutes. He was just motoring through these questions, and I knew in 3 to 5 minutes that he was ready for his math test, and in fact, he got a 92, so of course he was ready, right? But what we're going to see today through this dark night of Jesus' life, the last night of his life, is that our production is based upon our preparation. Whether you're going through a test, an exam, a driver's test, or the storms of life, all of us at some point will be squeezed. We'll have pressure. We'll have to face fears of failure and fears of inadequacy and fears of not having enough or measuring up. All of us will have to face that time of testing. And all of us will be tested to the point where we'll get a result for our test. Some of us will pass the test and ace the test, and some of us will fail the test. And I've found in life that we usually get what we deserve when it comes to our tests. As much as we want to complain against the teachers, like I should have had an 88 and I got an 83, it's not the teacher's fault that I get an A or a C. It's usually up to who? It's up to me. So what we're going to see today is our production in those moments of intense testing and trials and fears is actually based upon our preparation before that time of testing. Because all of us, I hope I'm not shocking you, all of us are going to face times of testing in life. Have you discovered this? Maybe you're in one right now, right? You're like, duh, preacher. I mean, yes, I'm always in a trial. Like I just come through one, I'm waving at a bus coming through another one, right? There's always a trial. Yeah, we face times of testing and times of trial. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at the last night of Jesus' life. And he faced the fear, as Kayla mentioned earlier, the fear of public speaking is actually number one, and the fear of death is number two. And as Jerry Seinfeld so wisely observed, that means that the person in the casket is in a better position than the person doing the eulogy at a funeral. You guys get that one, right? Yeah. So it's interesting, the fear of public speaking, the fear of death, though. That's a big one, isn't it? The fear of losing our lives or the fear of losing a loved one. It's an incredibly intense fear, and Jesus had to go through this fear of death. Now we're going to be in Mark chapter 14, as I mentioned earlier, verses 32 to 42, and you might have an analog, old school copy of the Bible, or if you're new school, you might have the YouVersion Bible app, and if you've not downloaded that, highly recommend it. It's got all kinds of different languages and versions and Bible plans for you to follow up on. And if you've seen anything else in the last 4 weeks, you've seen this. Fear is a liar. Fear will lie to us and get us to do crazy things, but if we replace our fears with faith, and specifically the truth of God's word, that will help us to face our battles. Now, maybe you've known this or not, but the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are 4 different accounts of the same story. So, for example, let's say the Habs were going to play against the Maple Leafs on Saturday night, right? And so in the press box, there was RDS, French TV station. There was TSN, the English Canada version. There was the CBC was there. And it just so happened that NBC was there. The American network was there. And so all 4 of these different reporters were covering the same game, and all 4 had a slightly different perspective. And in a lot of ways, that's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are doing. They're telling the same story, but with slightly different emphases, different perspectives. Now, as we're going to look through the story of Mark today, know this, that the person that's recording this is actually the experience of Peter. This is through the eyes and ears and breath of Peter. Peter is translating his experiences to Mark as he's recording this dark night of the soul that Jesus experienced. So Mark 14, 32 to 42. Here's the question that I want us to wrestle today. I think it's a really important question. How can we prepare for the trials that are coming our way? How can we prepare today for the fears that we're scared to even say out loud? How can we prepare today for that testing season so that when that testing season comes, we can ace the test? Pretty good question, I think, right? So as we think about that question, let's answer that through the example and the life of Jesus. But also, just as we contrasted my 2 boys earlier, I want you to see the contrast between Peter and the disciples and Jesus as they go through the ultimate final exam. We're going to be in the setting of the Garden of Gethsemane, and that was right outside the city of Jerusalem. It was a place where Jesus oftentimes went with his disciples, and he prayed often. And it was interesting. I looked up the word Gethsemane, and do you know what the word Gethsemane means? Well, of course I do. I know it's on the tip of my tongue. No, you'd never know this unless you had to talk for 40 minutes every day, right? So every Sunday. Gethsemane means oil press. Oil press. And so in this grove were olives. And in this grove there were presses that would take those olives and smash them down, grind them down with high pressure and high volume to the point where they would get this precious commodity called olive oil. So think about that. Jesus is going through the olive press of his life, the ultimate final exam, facing the fear of death, the fear of torture, the fear of execution, the fear of crucifixion. And we're going to experience this together as we go through this dark night in Jesus' life. If you're ready, touch your neighbor and say, I am ready. And you're like, don't touch me. Get off. Get off. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, this hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Yet not what I will, but you will." Then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fail and fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more, he went away and he prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They didn't know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer." This is the word of the Lord. This is a glimpse that you and I get to experience through the eyes of Peter, as we get a deep, deep insight into seeing the darkest night of the soul of Jesus' life. His greatest fear is the fear of death, the fear of separation from his perfect relationship with his Father. That not only was he going to lose his life, not only was he going to lose his freedom, not only was he going to lose his comfort, his mom, his brothers, and his sisters, but I believe the greatest fear that Jesus was feeling in that moment was that for the very first time, if God didn't change his mind, he was going to have to be separated from his Father. Jesus had never sinned. Jesus had never broken relationship with his Father. Jesus always did what was good and right and perfect. He was consistent. He had a perfect prayer life. He had a perfect understanding of what his Father wanted him to accomplish. And God did miracles through Jesus' life. And wisdom came out of his mouth unlike anyone who's ever taught before. And when Jesus faced the prospect of being tortured and executed, what scared him the most wasn't the physical torment. It was the spiritual separation that was about to take place between his Father and himself. A perfect relationship. Now, as we see in the story, Jesus and the disciples faced this dark night of the soul in very different ways, didn't they? And as we look at the answer to the question, how do we prepare for the times of darkness? How do we prepare for the great fears that you and I are facing? How do we prepare today for the times of testing that have come and will continue to come? Maybe that one fear that you don't even want to say out loud because if it came true, it would wreck you and break you to pieces. Again, our production is based upon our preparation. We've got to start today. So let's look together if we can. Let's compare and contrast how Jesus prepared for this last night and how Peter and the disciples prepared for this last night, shall we? First, Jesus, let's look at him. How did he prepare for this ultimate fear of death? First of all, he brought 3 friends with him. He brought who? Peter, James, and John. And if you read before verse 32, you find something very interesting. Peter, James, and John, along with the other 9, said something like this. Jesus, you keep talking about death. You keep talking about, trials that are coming. Even if everyone else abandons you, Jesus, even if it means we have to go to jail, even, Jesus, if it means we have to go to and die for you, we're totally willing to do that. We got your back, Jesus. And so Jesus has said, well, okay, well, if you got my back, then you're going to come and pray with me. Awesome. Because wisely, Jesus didn't go through his dark night by himself. Write that down. If you're going to go through a trial and a time of testing, don't go through it alone. Christianity is not a solo sport. It is a team sport. We are better together, sharing life, shining light. Okay, So he brought Peter, James, and John. And he was very candid, wasn't he? He said to these guys, I am deeply distressed. I am overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He didn't hide the fact that he was fearful. He didn't hide the fact that he was scared out of his mind. He brought them with him, and he was candid with them. So first thing he did is he brought friends with him. Secondly, notice his body language, his body posture. Was Jesus standing like this and just being full of bravado and full of confidence? No, far from it. It says in the text that Jesus crumbled to the ground, laying prostrate with his face in the ground and likely beating his fist into the murky soil, pounding his fist. Father, take this cup from me. Have you ever been so desperate for an answer from God that the only thing you could do was hit your face on the ground? Have you ever been in such a desperate place in your marriage that the only thing you knew how to do was to lay down on your bed and just pound your fist into the bed, pound your fist into the floor, cry out to God until you couldn't cry anymore? Have you ever been there before? It's amazing that our physical posture and what that can do to match what's going on inside of our souls, isn't it? And Jesus shows us the ultimate posture of humility, the ultimate posture of being broken, the ultimate posture of surrendering. He's laying down. He's not full of bravado, full of self-confidence. In fact, he's the opposite. He's bearing his soul in front of his friends and bearing his soul in front of his Father. So he brings 3 friends with him. He's completely humble, completely surrendered in his body language. And then third, he prays. Now, a lot of times, unfortunately, prayer for me can be a last resort. But Jesus battles, I want you to see this, Jesus battles his fear of death through prayer. Jesus sees prayer as his battle. Jesus sees prayer as his armor. Jesus sees prayer as his way to win the battle in front of him. I hope you see that too. There's 4 things I want to point out about his prayer. You guys ready? And if you're taking notes, and you should be, this will help you. Grab your phone, write this down. This is 4 things that Jesus prays that you and I need to pray in the moment of testing so that when that testing comes, we'll be ready to respond. Ready? First of all, Jesus prays honestly. He prays honestly. He doesn't say, oh, I've got this all figured out and no big deal. I'm just going to go through this. I'm going to use my strength and my experience, my education. No, he's honest. He's honest about what he wants. Take this cup from me. He's honest about his brokenness. My sorrow is overwhelmed with grief. He's honest. Sometimes when we get into a small group, we'll start talking and praying like the same way, don't we? Isn't it interesting how we start repeating each other and sounding like each other? And just to give you encouragement, God is not impressed with the amount of words that you use. God's not impressed with the flowery or professional words that you use. You know what God's impressed with? A sincere heart. Jesus is not worried about repetition. He's not worried about saying the right formula of prayers, the right words. He's just simply bearing his soul. He's honest. And our God, you know what he's looking for, our Father? Just like every father is looking for, a sincere relationship with his daughter, a sincere relationship with his son. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Tell me what's really going on, right? He's honest. Secondly, though, Jesus doesn't just stop there. Jesus is bold. Jesus doesn't want to go to the cross. Jesus does not want to get executed. Jesus does not want to have nails driven into his hands and his feet. He doesn't want to be stripped naked in front of people. He doesn't want to be humiliated. He doesn't want to have agony. And most of all, he doesn't want to have that feeling of having the weight of every man and woman's sin on his shoulders for all time. He doesn't want any of that. And so he boldly prays this: Abba, Daddy. It's a term of endearment. Daddy, I know everything's possible for you. Please take this cup from me. Please let there be another way. I know that you can do anything, Daddy. I know that you can save Montreal any way that you want. And I know that you can save Berlin any way that you want. And I know that you can save Cebu in any way that you want. So take this cup from me. You know, Jesus tells stories in the Gospels about how he tells us to pray. You know what he tells about prayer? He says, keep asking, keep knocking. He says also that you don't receive because you don't ask. I wonder how many times you and I are waiting for a miracle, and Jesus is just waiting for us to ask. He tells stories about neighbors who will repeatedly knock on their neighbor's door at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. And finally, the neighbor gets up, not because they like the neighbor, because they want to get back to bed, right? And that's what he compares prayer with. He says, keep asking, keep knocking, be bold, ask for what you want. Don't get into the mind of God and think what he wants to hear. Tell him what's on your heart. Tell him what you want. Do you need strength? Do you need wisdom? Do you need financial provision? Do you need a good idea? Do you need endurance? Do you need patience? Be bold about that. Ask him. Knock on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knock. That leads me to the third way that Jesus prays. He's tenacious. It's a good word, isn't it? Tenacious. He's not going to give up. We see that in the text. It says that he says, Daddy, everything's possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And then it says in verse 39, once more he went away, and what? He prayed the same thing. Once more he went away and he prayed the same thing. He didn't know what else to say. Daddy, Daddy, take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. He prays the same thing. He's repetitive. He's tenacious. He's not giving up. He doesn't want to go through the cross. Can you blame him? He's seen executions from the Romans. It was brutal. Every historian that studied execution and crucifixion says that it was the most brutal form of public torture. It was humiliating. It was excruciating. In fact, you know what? The word excruciating comes from out of the cross. The English word excruciating comes from the physical act of torment that comes through the cross. And so can you blame Jesus for asking for the cup to go another way? Which means that, Father, I know that you can accomplish salvation in any way you choose. It doesn't have to be through crucifixion. I've read stories in the past of how you've showed up in miraculous ways and you've provided another way out. I'm just asking for that other way. Help a brother out, right? Jesus is honest. He's bold. He's tenacious. But here's the real secret to his prayer. At the end, he yields. He yields to the will of his Father. You know what a yield sign is? It's when two different lanes are merging together, right? And you've got if you're here and there's a yield sign in front of you, that means that there's traffic coming off of a highway, probably 60, 70, 80 kilometers an hour. And if you don't yield to that lane, what's going to happen? You're going to crash. Jesus ultimately prays a bold prayer, a tenacious prayer, an honest prayer. But at the end of the day, he realizes that his Father's plan might be different than his plan. Have you gotten to the place in your own spiritual life where you understand that his ways are not your ways? Have you begun to understand just a little bit at least that his thoughts are not always your thoughts? Have you come to understand in a gracious way that his ways oftentimes are better than what you ever prayed for? You see, what we have to understand about God is what theologians call the sovereignty of God, which means that God is always in control. He's in control in all of our storms. But here's the great thing about God. You see, we see our life and our checkbook and our relationships and how we feel physically. But God not only sees that, he sees everyone in the world at the same time. And he sees that when he allows us to go through a storm, how that might bless somebody else in our family or a friend at work or a friend at school. That sometimes he'll allow storms to come into our lives in such a way that it will bless and revive the faith of the people around us. See, God not only sees everyone at the same time, but he sees all of history at the same time. Now, if you can figure that one out, come and talk to me later because you're way smarter than me. But God doesn't see time. God's able to see ancient time and future time in the same breath. And so at the end of the day, we've got to tell God what we want, but then we've also got to yield and say, yet you might have a better plan. And Father, if it means that I'm going to give my life so that people in Montreal in 2019 can experience forgiveness and freedom, then I'm willing to do that. Is anybody glad today that Jesus was able to yield to the will of the Father? Is anyone glad today that your marriage has been restored because the same power that rose Christ from the dead was available to your marriage when it was distressed? You see, I'm glad that Jesus fought all those battles, that dark night of the soul, by bringing 3 people with him, by prostrating on the ground, which means that he was surrendered and humble before God. And then he prayed those 4 different ways: honest, bold, tenacious, and a yielding prayer. And we're going to see the result of that in just a moment. Now, that's how Jesus decided to fight the battle. How did the disciples fight the battle? Again, Peter and the disciples were like, "Yo, Jesus." I'm not sure if they said "yo," but that's my spin on it. "Yo, Jesus, I got your back." I'm not sure about James. He's a bit of a weakling, but me and John, we got your back. We're always going to be there with you. Even if we got to go to jail, even if we got to die, you can count on us because we're fishermen. We're studs, right? We're Iron Men. Self-confidence, right? Self-confidence, bravado. And how did the disciples respond to that same moment of testing? Now, remember this. If Jesus is going to get executed by the Romans at the hands of the Jews, and their lives are tied to the fate of Jesus, what's going to happen to the disciples? Same thing. They are going to get executed. They are going to get tried. They are going to be tortured. And so the same emotions that was going through Jesus' thoughts and his heart had to be going through the disciples. And yet, how they responded to that fear was very, very different. Disciples were self-confident. Peter was self-confident. And Jesus invited them to hang out with him for support, for strength. And what did they do? They slept. Jesus was battling, pounding his fist, pounding heaven's door, pounding for answers, pounding for another way, pounding for God's will to be done. The disciples were watching some Netflix. The disciples had a warm blankie on. Have you ever been in such a time of testing and pressure that the only thing that sounded good to you was a little bit of wine, a warm blanket, and some Netflix? Because maybe that bill will go away. Maybe Canada Revenue Agency will go away magically. Maybe my marriage will ultimately get better if I continue to avoid it. Maybe my relationship with my kids will just magically get better. And so ultimately, the disciples chose sleep. And really what they were doing is they were soothing themselves. And am I the only one that soothes themselves like a little baby sometimes? Right? Got the pressure on us. So we turn to a substance, we turn to caffeine, or we turn to alcohol, or we turn to Netflix. We actually physically go back to bed. We kind of put the covers over our head, and we're in denial. Jesus gives us the model of how we face our fears and how we go into battle in prayer. We're active, we're battling, we're honest, we're tenacious, we're bold, we're yielding. The disciples were simply soothing themselves by sleeping. Maybe if we close our eyes, it will just go away. And so let's look at the result. The test came. The final exam came. What did they produce as that exam came? Well, we see at the last verse, is Jesus reluctant to go to the cross after this time of battling? Is he like, I really don't want to do this, and guess I'll just have to do it, kind of like Eeyore. I would be like that. If I lost the battle and my father said, you got to go to the cross, you got to execute, I would expect Jesus to be completely broken, completely tired, completely silent. But look at the last verse with me one more time. Can you guys pay attention? You guys cool for a couple minutes? He says this, the hour has come. The time of testing is over. His answer has now been fully given to his Father. He knows that there's no other path to save Montreal than through the cross. There's no other path to save Jerusalem than through the cross. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Listen to these last words, please. Rise. Let us go. Does that not sound like a soldier ready to go into battle? Rise. Let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Jesus went through that battle. He was surrendered. He brought his friends with him. He emerged stronger than before. In fact, Luke records the story that as he was praying and as he was battling God, you know what God did for him? He sent angels to minister to him, to strengthen Jesus. Isn't that amazing? The angel would not have strengthened him if Jesus wasn't willing to face his fears head on and to go to battle in prayer. Jesus, though, he emerges peaceful and prepared. He's not reluctant to go to the cross. If you've ever watched The Passion of the Christ, or if you've ever watched the same kind of show on Netflix, the Son of God series, I've always marveled at how Jesus was able to say on the cross, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Have you ever wondered why Jesus was able to do that? In the middle of being mocked, rocks thrown upon him, insult after insult, being stripped naked, bleeding out of every orifice, struggling for every breath. How was it that Jesus was able to look down at the people shouting at him, shouting obscenities at him, blasphemies at him? How was Jesus able to say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing? You know why? Jesus tells us why. Because he was prepared. Because he knew that he was following the plan of God. Because he was willing to obey and understand that God's ways are better than his ways. And if God was going to ask him to go through the cross, then he was going to do it with grace and with dignity and with strength. Have you ever wondered why Jesus was able to turn to one of the thieves on the cross who at the beginning of the day was railing insults at him and shouting profanities at him? How when that same executed man was able to turn to Jesus and say, remember me. Jesus turned to him and said, today you will be with me in paradise. Think about that. How did Jesus have the strength as he himself was gasping for air that he was actually going to do some evangelism on the cross? That he was actually not going to think about his own pain and his own predicament, but he's actually going to turn to another thief that deserved death. And he was going to say to him, friend, at the end of this day, when you breathe your last death, you're going to be with me in paradise. How did Jesus have that kind of strength? He had that kind of strength because he faced his fears in battle with his friends, in battle through prayer. He was tenacious and yielded to the very end. Aren't you glad he did? On the other hand, Jesus is ready to go. He's peaceful. He's prepared. The disciples are just stumbling around, aren't they? They're sleeping. How many people have ever gotten up from a nap and like you got this headache and you're like, I can't see straight. I don't know what day it is. Like that 20-minute nap turned into a 3-hour nap. And like I woke up my kid from a nap the other day. And he's like, what are you doing? It's like 7 in the morning. Like, dude, it's like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He had no concept of the day, right? Isn't that funny about naps? It's kind of totally messes with your circadian rhythm and you can't walk straight. You're stumbling into stuff and stammering around. That's what happened to the disciples as they chose to sleep through the trial. They got ready to write their final exam, and they were stumbling and slumbering, and they had a headache. They didn't know what was going on. They were in chaos. They were scared out of their minds. In fact, just a couple of minutes after this incident took place, all of them ran away. They ran away. They started out being so self-confident. I got your back, Jesus. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you. You can count on me. As soon as everything went down, as soon as that pressing took place, Jesus stood up, faced his betrayer. The disciples ran away. How many people want to be ready to face the battles in your life? How many people want to ace the test, the true tests of life? How many people want to ace the test when it comes your way? We know that times of testing come, and they come often. And here's an example of how we can be ready when those testing comes, when we face the fear of death, or we face the prospect of a diagnosis, when we're up late at night wondering if we're going to matter. We have a fear of not measuring up. We have a fear of cancer. We have a fear of failure. As we think about our own lives, I want to show you 3 steps, 3 examples from the life of Jesus that you and I can do in our time of testing. You ready? Again, if you're taking notes, first is, it's really simple. It's ABC, so it's easy to remember. So how do we face our times of testing? A, B, C. A, admit. Don't deny that you're in fear. Don't deny that you're struggling. Don't deny that you're lonely. Don't deny that your marriage is on the rocks. Admit that you've got a problem. Admit that you've got a fear that you can't answer. Admit that you've got a weakness that you can't answer. Reach out. B, as you have that humility to reach out, you bring people into that fear with you. Jesus brought Peter, James, and John. If you were to get a health diagnosis, or if your mom was to pass away, or if you had to deal with the sickness of a child, who are the 3 people that you would call instantly? Who are your 3? We want everybody to be in a group at City Church. We want you to get out of a row from Sundays and get into a group midweek in different parts of the city. If you're not in a city group, I want to urge you right now, pull out your phone. Text the word groups, GROUPS, to 514-700-4885. We want you to get into a group, share life with people. Jesus gives us the model that we don't go through life alone. If you're struggling in your marriage, don't go through life alone. If you're filled with anxiety and depression and weariness as a mom, don't go through it alone. Don't isolate. Don't stay in your house by yourself. Invite people over. Go to them. Reach out for help. So who are your 3? Choose people that are godly people. People that are going to lift up your hands. People that are going to encourage you. People that are going to pray for you. Don't we all need people like that? So admit that you've got weakness. Admit that all of us are broken. We're just broken in different ways. Bring 3 people into that trial, into your life. And then C, choose. Choose to do battle through prayer. Don't use prayer as a last resort, but use prayer as your greatest source of strength. If you forget anything else, remember this, that your Father in heaven delights in you. He is well pleased with you. He is the kind of father that gives good gifts to his children. And he will strengthen you. He will give you wisdom. He will give you resources. He will help you through that time of testing. And you will emerge out of that time stronger than you were before. But you've got to make a choice, just like Peter had to make a choice and Jesus had to make a choice. I'm either going to face this battle through prayer or I'm going to self-soothe myself. I'm just going to Netflix and chill. I'm just going to put a blanket over my head. I'm just going to retreat. I'm just going to use substances or alcohol or whatever to escape what's going on. And if we want to ace the battles in front of us, we've got to choose to do battle in prayer. How did Jesus pray? Just real quickly as a recap. He prayed honestly. He prayed boldly. He prayed tenaciously. And ultimately, he yielded. You know what this story tells us, among other things? That there are some storms that you'll just have to go through. Some of us will have to go through the battle of cancer, as I shared last week with my own family. Although there's many storms that Jesus can say, peace, be still, and he does it, and he takes it out of our lives, there are some tests that God, in his sovereignty, again, will allow us to go through. Not everything will pass. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take courage, take heart, because I have overcome the world. And as you go through that dark night, that dark fear that you don't want to even say out loud, you can be encouraged to know that God is with you. He will never leave you. He'll never forsake you. And he's going to provide the friendships around you to support you and strengthen you so that you will emerge stronger than ever before. ABC. You guys remember that? Last week, I shared a really difficult story from my own life about my father passing away. And I got to tell you that even though I'm up on stage every week speaking for 30 to sometimes way too long, I'm an introvert, and I don't enjoy being vulnerable. Does anybody just like sharing the worst part of themselves on stage? Like, I actually have a fear of public speaking, so isn't that ironic that God chose me to be a preacher? I get to go through that fear every single week. I get butterflies in my stomach. I get a little sick every Sunday, and my voice starts breaking down. And it's only by God's grace that I'm up on this platform, by the way. And I got to share, because I believe that God uses us in our brokenness, that you can impress people from afar, but you can impact people through your brokenness. And so I shared the doubts, and I shared the fears of losing my father through cancer, and I shared how difficult that was. And today I want to share another hard story from my own life, not to make you feel sorry for me. Please, see Jesus in this. But I want you just to understand how I applied this very truth to my own life as I went through my greatest fear, which is for my family to disappear. My greatest fear was that my marriage would fail. My greatest fear was that somehow I wouldn't be around my boys every day. That's what kept me up at night. And even though I had that fear and I had that intentionality, there hit a point in our life in July of 2015 where our marriage was in a really, really rough shape. And if you've been coming to City Church for a while, you've maybe heard us share versions of the story over and over again, but we're going to keep sharing that story because I believe that God wants to bring freedom to marriages and freedom to relationships. And God brought us to the point where we were really at odds with each other. And there was no infidelity, there was no pornography, there was nothing obvious between us, but there was a lot of bitterness. There was a lot of brokenness between my wife and I. There was a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of hurt and resentment, and it was a Cold War in our house. We were functional, we were raising our kids, we were doing our work, we were taking care of our bills, but between the two of us, there wasn't a lot of love, there wasn't a lot of good vibes going on. And it had been going on for several months, and it got to the point where it was really, really desperate, and to the point where my wife was heading down in September, so a couple of months after that whole thing started, she was going down for a wedding in Texas, and she was taking my boys. And I couldn't go for a reason I can't remember at the time, but she was going with my two boys. And she said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, "I don't know if I can come back." And again, that when she said that, like, it still grieves me. It was the thing that I never thought I would hear my wife say to me. I thought I was a pretty good guy. I thought I was doing okay. But when she said that, all those fears just rushed back. And I got to be honest with you, there was two Chris's in that moment that wanted to respond in two very opposite ways. The first was to say, "Fine, go. I've done what I can do, and these are all your issues. I've done everything I can do, and there's a problem with you." And marriages that don't make it have that attitude. It's that entitlement. It's that selfish looking at the other person and blaming them for everything. If you want to see a marriage heading the wrong direction, you'll see a person blaming the spouse for every issue, or blaming their parents, or blaming their grandparents, or blaming the government, or blaming someone else, instead of looking in the mirror and saying, "I'm the problem." So part of me was just wanting to deny that there was an issue, turn on some Netflix, go back to bed, and just deny that there's a problem. And that's exactly why we were in that predicament, because the two of us were stubborn. The two of us were trying to do it alone. The two of us were thinking that the other person was the person that was in the wrong. But as soon as she left and flew down to Texas, I got on the phone. And I called some mentors. And I called some of my pastor friends. And I said, "You've got to pray for us. We've got this serious thing going on." I thought it was bad, but I didn't realize it was this bad. And I shared with them. I was very vulnerable with all the things that were going on. And I got immediate help. And then I reached out to a marriage counselor that had done our marriage counseling. I got her on the phone, even though she was in Texas. I had a phone appointment with her, and I got her on the schedule for several other meetings with my wife and I through Skype. And by the time that Yancy and I talked 2 days later, I could tell that there's already a difference in the communication. And I had figured that because we were so at odds with one another, we were so estranged from one another at that point, there was so much bitterness and stuff between us, I just assumed that it would be years before we could ever enjoy each other again. I thought it would take years to fight to get that back. And I want to encourage you with this, that as we reached out for help, and as we included other people in our prayers, and as we started to be honest with our own shortcomings and our own bitterness and the reasons why we had gotten into that predicament, as we were honest and included other people in it, God did a miracle in our marriage. A miracle. And it wasn't only a couple of weeks. It was maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks later. that God completely restored our relationship. And today, 5 years later, we are stronger than we've ever been before. Why do I say that? It's because out of our brokenness and out of our greatest fears, God can do the greatest work. But we've got to fight through prayer. And we've got to fight by including good, godly people around us for perspective and for support. And we've got to ultimately get down on the ground sometimes and pound our fists into the ground to say, God, if you don't show up, this marriage is over. God, if you don't show up, our financial condition is going to be shattered. God, if you don't show up, I'm going to get fired. God, if you don't show up, this health diagnosis is going to destroy and rip apart our family. At the end of the cross, something miraculous took place 3 days later, is the resurrection. As difficult it was for Jesus to go through the cross, the thing that kept him going was to know that Jesus would one day rise again. And because of the resurrection, we have the same power available to us. Let me say that again. Because of the resurrection, Jesus didn't stay in the grave. He rose again on the third day. And the Bible tells us that the same power that rose Christ from the dead is available for your marriage. It's available for your patience. It's available for your endurance. It's available for every part of brokenness and fear that you and I are facing right now. My question is, are you going to take that power? Are you going to battle with God in prayer? Are you going to include people in that so that you can experience the breakthrough that you've been waiting for? It's a question I want you to leave with you today. Are you going to take the power of God? Or are you going to soothe yourself and deny that there's something going on? Because there is power available through the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. Amen? We're going to sing. I want to invite the band to come forward right now because I want to have a time of response. The last couple of weeks, we've allowed this space in front of the stage to be a place of response. And this is no different. Today, if you're here and you've never cried out to God for salvation, maybe you respect Jesus, maybe you admire Jesus, but you've never had a moment where you've actually turned the keys of your life over to this Jesus who is willing to go to the cross for you. Today, I beg you to come forward as a sign of surrender, to say, I'm crying out to you, God, for salvation. Romans 10:13 says this, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Today, if you don't know that there's a place for you in heaven, if you don't know that God delights in you, if you don't know that you can be forgiven from your shame and from your guilt, come forward today as a physical act of surrender. Just like Jesus physically got on the ground and surrendered, today I want to ask you to come forward to ask God for salvation. But there's many people here that have already done that, but you need to cry out to God today for strength. You're struggling in your marriage. You're struggling with pressure. You're struggling with a health diagnosis and you don't know what the future is going to hold. You've got this constant sense that you're not good enough, that you don't matter enough. And today, I want you to connect your physical body with a spiritual reality that you come forward and ask God for strength. We will pray for you. We're going to stand together as we sing this next song. And if that's you today, if you want to cry out to God for salvation, if you want to cry out to God for strength, come forward so that we can pray together, we can stand together, and we can ace the test of life that is coming our way. Amen? Because of how Jesus faced death, because of how Jesus faced the greatest trial, He has given us all the strength and all the resources to face the trials of life. And one day, one glorious day, we will stand with God in a place where there is no mourning, a place where there is no more testing, a place that is just peaceful because we're in the presence of God forever. So everyone, can you stand to your feet? We're going to sing this song called Fear is a Liar. And if you need strength today, or if you need to call out to God for salvation today, come forward so that we can celebrate with you and join hands with you to see God do a miracle